Hello, welcome. It's July 15th, 2023, and it's PaperStream number 6.0. Here, I'm going to be talking through a paper from 2021, Active Inference in Modeling Conflict, and this was a collaborative work along with Scott David and RJ Corday. I just wanted to give an introductory walk through this paper. No slides, just going through the sections of the paper, just so that people can interact with it, engage with the topics and ideas through this format. So if you're watching live, looking forward to your comments and questions. And if you're watching after, hope that you enjoy this work and follow along in that way. I'll read the abstract first. In this paper, we integrate conflict studies with active inference, a developing framework which provides an integrative and systems-level perspective on cognition and behavior. This formalization, the Active Inference Conflict, AIC model, situates conflict in terms of a multiscale process of communication, trust, and relationship management enacted by interacting entities. The AIC model helps capture and extend the insights of previous models applied to aspects of conflict and war, such as OODA loops, observe-orient-decide-act, the generations of warfare model, and the Rumsfeld Matrix. The AIC model aids in the analysis of pertinent aspects of modern conflict, such as cyber, psychological, biological, informational, financial, and ideological conflict, that are not amenable to coherent or consistent analysis using traditional models of human conflict. AIC is demonstrated to be of use in both monitoring and studying conflict, as well as in designing systems intended to facilitate controlled or managed conflict in scenarios characterized by business, operational, legal, technical, and social, or BOLTS components. Insights and implications from qualitative use are used as a foundation for offering recommendations for future research and social systems design. All right, into the paper we go. So I'll just try to walk through. Of course, one can read the full paper and dig into the references if they want to do so. This is just intended to be a listenable and engaging introduction to some of the highlights, at least as they appear to me about 2 years after we wrote it. Here's the table of contents, and I'll just read the section headers. Introduction. Previous models of military conflict. Narrative models of conflict. Collections of heuristics. Military revolutions model. Generations of warfare framework. Lynn's model of strategic narrative. Quantitative models of conflict. Lanchester models. Fault tree analysis. Effects-based operations. DODAF. Systems warfare. Models of conflict, information flows, and decision-making. Observe-orient-decide-act, OODA model. Rumsfeld Matrix of knowing. Essential features and limitations of past conflict models. Active Inference Conflict model. Active Inference overview, terms and features. Active terms. Active features. Use of the AIC model. Entity action loop and alignment with OODA. Unifying quantitative and formal models of conflict, moving beyond generations of warfare, modeling and discovering BOLTS conflict, modeling cognitive security, implications from use, future information structures and Rumsfeld's neglected quadrant, discussion, contribution statements, funding and acknowledgements. We're excited. All right, into the introduction we go. The introduction begins with a consideration of human conflict, whether known as warfare or otherwise, and highlights that the game has changed. And I'm sure there's many sources that people can go to find this out, and many ways that people have of talking about this incredibly complex setting in terms of modern conflict. Due to these changes, the resulting dramatic increase in costs and displacement of kinetic war compels state and non-state actors to pursue their conflicting interests through alternative means. The resulting complex threat surfaces are not always well described or modeled by existing frameworks for conflict, which usually have a military or domain-specific focus, which further amplifies risk even in tractable scenarios. So this is the big conclusion that's going to get worked to in the first part of the paper, which is going to pretty copiously review various kinds of frameworks for conceptualizing of conflict before we conclude these models of conflict don't have the expressivity or the flexibility to describe the kinds of situations that we're interested in modern conflict, yes, but really just modern scenarios generally. What can we do about it? Well, in this paper, we make use of active inference, or ActInf, a framework which provides an integrative and systems-level perspective on cognition and behavior to propose a new formalization of conflict in terms of a multiscale process of communication, trust, and relationship management. And we call this application of active inference to conflict the Active Inference Conflict model, or the AIC model. We next look towards a few of the frameworks that we're going to discuss in more detail soon: generations of warfare, or the GW model, observe-orient-decide-act loops, the OODA loop, and the Rumsfeld Matrix. And we argue that the AIC embraces as well as extends these different models. So we intend this model to not just generalize beyond conflict, but also think more holistically about business, operation, legal, technical, and social, or BOLTS, activities. So we hope that this paper gives a really broad historical view and also introduces something new into the discussion, which is active inference, a unifying cognitive modeling framework. And so we hope that that's exciting. The paper is going to begin with a survey of qualitative and quantitative models of conflict and the work that they have done. And these models have been, and in many cases are, in use in high reliability settings. So it's absolutely not to put any of them down. It's just to describe them for what they are and try to talk about where active inference connects with them. After the survey of models, we're going to consider some essential features of what we learned across the models, and then emphasize the need for models that have more interoperability across domains and better generalization. We then move into an introduction, a short one, of the active inference framework and try to introduce only the terms that we really need to talk about the AIC. The Rumsfeld Matrix, we're going to talk more about later, and it's going to also be revisited at the end of the paper in a discussion of Rumsfeld's neglected quadrant, the unknown knowns. We'll hear more about it soon. And we conclude here. The AIC model is an applied active inference approach for mitigating risk and enhancing value from the ever-increasing informational component of modern interactions, warfare or not. And finally, we conclude with a summary of insights and recommendations for future research and application. All right, so the first section is going to be a relatively lengthy review on various different models of military framework. Models of military conflict have been some of the most mission-critical areas of scholarship over the last thousands of years. One can look back to basically any society, any time, and look at the vastness of this body of literature. And as this sentence notes, even if only a small fraction of this vast corpus of war literature were about generalizations, that would still be quite a large amount. So we acknowledge that it's an impossible task to review and describe all models, but perhaps in time we can do that together. We separate the models that we're about to review right now into three broad categories. Narrative models, which is to say conversational or story-like models. Quantitative models, which use some formal or numerical aspects. And then conflict information flows and decision-making models, to highlight some unique features of models that highlight message passing and communication architectures amongst agents. So first, narrative models of conflict. The term narrative model is used here to describe formal and semi-formal models of conflict, which are intended to provide guidance and actionable insight to strategic commanders through the use of qualitative, non-technical methods, such as storytelling, aphorisms, historical example, parables, and slogans. I'll also just mention before we jump deeper in that this section was heavily based upon the scholarship of RJ. So thanks again, RJ, for the amazing work in curating and bringing together all these different aspects. All right, first, collections of heuristics. So, again, I won't read everything because that's what the paper itself is for, that you can pause the video and read, or you can go find the paper itself. But I'll just point out that the earliest attempts to create and compile informative representations of war are really like folk wisdoms and ways. They're collections of axioms, idioms, recipes, rules, patterns, and principles. So let's check out a few of them. For example, from Flavius Vegetus Renatus, Epitome Re Militaris, or the epitome of military science. And before we read these, we might consider this explicit, declarative, propositional knowledge, or a prompt. It is difficult to beat someone who can form a true estimate of his own and the enemy's forces. He who spends more time watching in outposts and puts more effort into training soldiers will be less subject to danger. Never lead forth a soldier to general engagement except when you see that he expects victory. Pretty interesting about the expectation, because that's going to come back when we think about expectations and preferences in active inference. Here are some sayings from Sun Tzu's Art of War. A skillful soldier does not raise a second levy. In order to kill the enemy, our men must be roused to anger. If equally matched, we can offer battle. If slightly inferior in numbers, we can avoid the enemy. If quite unequal in every way, we can flee. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the results of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. And from Moltke's Art of War. Excessive extension of the front brings danger of a breakthrough. Engagements in forests last for a long time. One must immediately prepare supporting points captured in an engagement for defense in order to thwart the enemy's efforts to recapture them. So, many qualitative literature works discussing war. Two more recent works are reviewed, and these are Jomini's Art of War and Karl von Clausewitz's On War. So, from Jomini, he describes different motivations of states to engage in warfare, and 2 kinds of international intervention, as well as 4 kinds of war that result from intervention. Clausewitz goes further and argues, in fact anticipating directions that military science took in later years, argued that even more generalizable analysis is needed, and that those who, quote, never rise above anecdote will never get down to the general factors that govern the matter. Indeed, they will consider a philosophy that encompasses the general run of cases as a mere dream. So, Clausewitz was well aware of the limitations of these prior descriptions of warfare and made explicit the benefits of more comprehensive multidimensional models that would situate warfare amongst other forms of human conflict. For example, the famous quotation, "Politics is war by other means." Clausewitz, in pursuit of deeper generalizations, proposed what may be the earliest framework for describing warfare that is recognizable on its face as a generalizable model. He suggests that war is an extension of state policy, and as such it is ruled by a paradoxical trinity of forces. And there are some quotations here. The trinity of forces here are the people, the commander and his army, and the government, and that's discussed. Our task, therefore, is to develop a theory that maintains a balance between these 3 tendencies, like an object suspended between 3 magnets. So this trinity of war model captures these multi-node complex systems and even nods towards nonlinearity in the example of the magnet. And we described that Clausewitz's model was quite far ahead of its time in terms of framing war as a complex system rather than some straightforward mechanistic process. Clausewitz wrote, "Chance, uncertainty, and friction will make anticipation of even the first-order consequences of military action highly conjectural." More recently, the military revolutions model has been described and utilized, and you will hear this, depending on what and how you listen, you will hear this all over the place. So, military revolutions models describe different phases or kind of thematic genres that military engagements reflect and describes how those change. So here's going to be a few military revolution type models. First, the Krupanovich model. So the Krupanovich model describes chronologically several different revolutions that happened. Infantry, artillery, sail and shot, fortress, gunpowder, Napoleonic, land warfare, naval, mechanization, aviation, and information, and nuclear revolution. So Krupanovich is focusing on warfare alone. However, this model is an explicit recognition that changes in technology affect the nature of engagement in war. In that sense, he saw technology as the vehicle through which large-scale social and historical changes affect war, and vice versa. Knox and Murray's model has a few differences from the previous military revolution type models. What are they? First, they explicitly included non-military systematic changes within the scope of revolutions, such as related to economics beyond ability to supply armaments. So it's a little bit more broad than just military. Second, each of the revolutions were seen as reflecting not just the innovations of the time, but also the integrations and the precedents from the past. Third, they included two separate tracks of revolution, seemingly inspired by Krupanovich's suggestion that the inflection points in the expression of warfare were separable from the implementations and incorporations of technical innovations. One was termed military revolutions, and the other revolutions in military affairs, referring to the abstract inflection points and revolutionary implementations, respectively. And so, in the Knox and Murray model, they slightly differently categorized things. First, they described anticipatory revolutions, such as the introduction of the technologies of the longbow, gunpowder, and fortress architecture. They described Military Revolution 1 as the modernization of the state and military institutions. Military Revolutions 2 and 3 was the French and the Industrial Revolutions. The Fischer Revolution, which was the introduction of all big gun battleships. Military Revolution 4, the First World War and its irrevocable combination of preceding revolutions. They framed World War I in terms of combined armed tactics, blitzkrieg operations, carrier, submarine, and amphibious warfare, as well as radar and signals intelligence. And chronologically, they described Military Revolution 5 as being associated in the latter half of the 1900s with nuclear weapons and ballistic delivery systems, as well as precision reconnaissance and strike capacities, strike systems, and increased lethality of conventional munition. Next, military revolution model, the Hoffman model. Hoffman focuses on what comes after the 5 revolutions within the Knox and Murray model through the lens of the Clausewitz Trinity. And so, a summary of the Hoffman model of military revolutions and their key features is described here. He describes the Westphalian system in terms of nation-state revenue generation, banking, taxes, and professionalized militaries. The French Revolution in terms of national mobilization. The Industrial Revolution in terms of mass production, standardization, and large-scale economic exploitation. World Wars in terms of their combined arms, armored blitzkrieg, carriers, bombers, and jets. The Nuclear Revolution associated with nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles. as well as the information revolution, command and control infrastructures, connectivity, and global reach, imagery, and ideological activity en masse. And last in the Hoffman models is the autonomous revolution. Autonomous weapons, swarms of robotic vehicles, self-organizing defense systems, big data analytics, and deep learning systems. Now, on to the revolution model that probably has the most broad usage today. And that's the generations of warfare framework, developed by William Lind et al. And this is actually published in the Marine Corps periodical, the Gazette. The GW framework, or Generations of War framework, has arguably achieved broad use and a great deal of commentary as well as critique and adaptation. For example, people commonly today discuss 5th generation warfare, 5GW, beyond the 4 initially described generations of warfare. And so here is a summarization of the 4 generations of warfare as described by Lind et al. First generation, line and column tactics. Second generation, fire and movement. Third generation, nonlinear tactics. Fourth generation, whole of society. With the associated ideological differences, operational art practiced in small teams and in the gray zone between military and civilian, and indeed a reliance on gray zone warfare in terms of psychological and informational operations that target a society's culture and narrative. Gradients of Warfare model, the XGW model, was proposed by Daniel Abbott as a slight elaboration on this Generations of Warfare or Revolutions of Warfare model. And here's the key difference between the previous models just discussed and the Gradients of Warfare model. Although the gradient and generation are often used interchangeably, the gradient model abandons chronological development and the concept of a generation, and instead describes movement along a single finite abstract axis, representing an arbitrary gradient of diffusion or concentration related to a particular conflict. So the models that were just described are primarily historical, if not directly chronological, whereas this generalization moves beyond the timeline and abstracts conflict activity outside of the chronology in which it actually happened in. And so what are these gradients? The zeroth gradient, genocide and all of society warfare, ant colonies, ethnic cleansing. The first gradient, physical concentration of resources. For example, non-human primate border patrols and medieval warfare. The second gradient is increased concentration of effort, where efforts are directed towards the same place at the same time. The third gradient is a coordination and concentration of operational art, for example, the Blitzkrieg. The fourth gradient has a focus on degrading the opponent into an earlier generation of warfare and reflects decentralized gray zone conflict. Again, akin to the fourth generation of warfare, however, moved outside of a chronological framework. Whereas the fifth gradient is purely described as the coordination and concentration of ideology. Next, Kohalek made a projection of the gradient model. Based upon Abbott's assertions about the nature of gradients, Kohalek projected onto John Boyd's OODA loop, observe-orient-decide-act loop. This exercise demonstrates that Abbott's gradients of warfare can be repurposed, not just to describe levels of diffusion, but also the basis for that diffusion and the changes to the basis over time. This provides a more stable view on the generations of warfare model that the gradients were originally intended to replace. And here are what those projections are. The first gradient, characterized by the transition between decision and action. The second gradient, characterized by the gap between orientation and decision. The third gradient, the disruption of orientation. The fourth gradient, the gap between observation and orientation. And the fifth gradient, prioritization of the disruption of observation. So here we see a simple OODA loop and the generations or the gradients of warfare annotating where different interventions can occur. Continuing on with the final narrative model of conflict, Lin's model of strategic narrative. Lin proposes 3 general abstract narratives encoded into theoretical groups which hold them: guardians, heroes, and managers. Guardians model war as a science subject to laws and principles. Heroes model war as an art, dependent upon military genius, experience, training, morale, and discipline. The final group, managers, model war as a logical outreach of politics, economics, logistics, resource mobilization, standardization of equipment, and the assignment of professionals. And so that concludes the section on narrative models or informal models of conflict. On to quantitative models of conflict. The term quantitative models of conflict is used here to describe the models of conflict which sit in clear separation from qualitative and narrative models, attempting to frame conflict in terms of formalized mathematics and computational structure. Several such models are summarized here. First, the Lanchester models. Lanchester models are likely the earliest substantial quantitative model of warfare. Lanchester introduced a series of quantitative rules, such as the n-squared law, which was that the measure of the total of fighting strength of a force will be the square of the sum of the square roots of the strength of its individual units. Sum of squares, linear regression, L2 norm. And Lanchester introduced the usage of differential equations to describe processes like attritional dynamics. He also introduced the use of geometry to describe multi-domain operations. Though introduced in the early 20th century, Lanchester models are still adapted today to represent things such as force ratios and the importance of information in guerrilla warfare and insurgencies. Next quantitative model, fault tree analysis. Fault tree analysis decomposes potential failure states of a system into sub-events that allows the modeler to better understand the potential for cascading failures. So it's kind of like a random forest or like a Bayesian causal graph. Next formal model, effects-based operations, or EBO. Effects-based operations is a form of course of action planning for military operations characterized by the use of Bayesian graphical models, as well as using these techniques to model complex systems. EBO is primarily a planning tool. However, it embraces a systems warfare approach by modeling an area of operations as a series of components which are then acted on to generate effects which cascade throughout the system. Next quantitative framework, DODAF. The U.S. Department of Defense Architecture Framework, or DODAF, is a military architecture framework describing planning, procurement, and deployment of various military systems. DODAF, according to our interpretation of it, limited that we know, is very aligned with Lin's concept of a manager's view of war above, because it's a very logistical and system of systems view. Next, systems warfare. Western network-centric warfare, Chinese systems confrontation warfare, and the Russian Gerasimov doctrine are all examples of modern updates to military doctrine necessitated by the rise of gray zone warfare. Some more details are described on Russian, Chinese, and American complex system and system of systems conflict models. Next major section, models of conflict information flows and decision making. So, the previous categories focused on the historical and qualitative, which was the narrative models of conflict, and the quantitative and data-driven, that was the quantitative models of conflict. Here, we describe models that have been developed with a behavioral focus, whether they take a qualitative or quantitative approach. These models of information flows are not just explanatory. They are used in national militaries to inform design and decision-making. As such, they have real impact and need to accurately and appropriately describe systems. And so we're going to talk about a few of them. First, the observe-orient-decide-act, or OODA model, introduced by John Boyd. And there's a ton to learn in this area of John Boyd and OODA. So what can be said briefly? The OODA loop was originally designed to help describe and inform real-time decision-making by fighter pilots, where a pilot observes the variables and surrounding, orients the aircraft to an advantageous position, decides the following course of actions in order to engage, and then implements them. We'll see a figure soon. Next model of information flows and decision-making is the Rumsfeld Matrix. Now, this was not initially proposed as a framework for action and perception, but rather was merely a response provided by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld to a question asked about the lack of evidence of weapons of mass destructions in Iraq. And Rumsfeld said, "Reports that say something hasn't happened are always interesting to me, because as we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know. And if one looks throughout the history of our country and other free countries, it is the latter category that tend to be the difficult ones." We're going to return to a very interesting neglected quadrant. If you look at this quotation by Rumsfeld, you'll see he only mentions 3 areas of the quadrant. However, we've generalized that and clarified, and also pointed to the work of many analysts who ignore this 4th quadrant. So, now some visualizations of the information flow. Here's the plan, do, check, act. Plan, do, checked, act. Here's the stimulus, hypothesis, option, response loop. And here's the Endsley model, where situational awareness has influence from the environment, and it's a decision-making model. Here we see a very, very simplified version of the OODA loop and a visualization of the Rumsfeld quadrant model. Now we're going to bring this section to a close by describing some of the essential features and limitations of past conflict models. We try to organize the models that we presented above to reveal an arc of abstraction across time, from simple pattern collection to formalism, and finally through generalized modeling, for example by abstracting beyond chronology. The survey also revealed a persistent challenge through time of problems of change management in the conduct of warfare, for example inconsistency and adjustment to new paradigms and changing historical circumstances. While each of the models described had, and in some cases have, an important place in the history of development and theory and practice of military science, each also suffers from weaknesses that prevent it from offering sufficiently comprehensive predictive and descriptive power in the gray zone conflicts of the 21st century and beyond. However, each model also has strengths and offers insights that we'd hope would be captured by any proposed synthesis model. So let's consider some key insights that can be brought forward in future models. So these insights are going to inform the AIC model that we propose. First, changing expression of conflict. A good model of conflict has to capture how things change. Next, limited interoperability. The value of a model of a system might be derived not just from how well it handles updates to information about that system or that domain, but also from how well it interfaces with other models. So interoperability and forward and backward compatibility. Next, generalization. In addition to being able to handle updates to information and the ability to interface described above, the potential value of a model might be further discerned based on how faithfully it is able to describe and integrate with other systems with one or more similar attributes, known as generalization. We're going to describe the generalization of war into business operating, legal, technical, and social domains, or BOLTs. Since war is a subcategory of human conflict, BOLTs-based parsing can help introduce potential pathways to integration for models of nation-state level conflict, including war. More details about warfare beyond the military. Other potentially useful non-warfare models of human conflict and management include models that analyze conflict within a commons, which has its own computational and narrative corpus. Research on commons management focuses on conflicts which can arise in markets and access to resources in which varied groups and actors have individual interests but collective ownership or stake. We could think about the oceans, the polar regions, the atmosphere, and so on, Spaceship Earth, and beyond. Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009 for her work in describing co-management regimes for addressing conflict in historical settings in the commons. And in Ostrom's book, Understanding Knowledge as a Commons, there are 8 principles for robust, long-enduring common pool resource institutions, and those are clearly defined boundaries, rules that are well matched to local needs and conditions. Individuals affected by these rules can participate in modification. The right of community members to devise their own rules is respected by external authorities. A system for self-monitoring members' behavior, a graduated system of sanctions, community members that have access to low-cost conflict resolution mechanisms, and nested enterprises. Hess and Ostrom developed the points above into the Institutional Analysis and Development, or IAD, framework. This framework is going to present a map of relevant variables to the expression of friction or conflict within what it calls the action arena. And here's a visualization of it. Now, it's very interesting. Of course, it makes sense that warfare models would be framed in terms of adversarial relationship, although, as described in the gray zone, it's not so clear. In contrast, commons-oriented models, as the name suggests, are more pro-social, or they're more oriented around win-win or synergetic behavior, or wanting things to work out best for the most. And yet, commons models deal with friction, and many of the design principles and patterns of effective commons deal with conflict. And so, in a sense, this is a blind spot of purely adversarial models. So let's just say you win, or whatever, and then what? Whereas if we think about the commons, Spaceship Earth, or however we want to think about it, then we may be able to put various other models of adversarial conflict into a commons-oriented institutional analysis and development framework. With this discussion of models of warfare and conflict above, there appears to be a need to account for new frameworks that encompass modern expressions of conflict, demonstrate interoperability across domains, and generalize well enough to encompass peaceful and rapidly changing times, as well as classical forms of conflict and related operations other than war, OOTW. An open challenge is for a computational model that captures the value and insights provided by various forms of previous narrative, quantitative, and information flow-based models of conflict. We don't want to discard. We don't want to rip and replace. We want to embrace and extend. In the following section, we address this need by proposing a framework based on active inference. Active inference is a unifying framework about sense-making and decision-making. It's a scale-free or scale-friendly or scale-independent way of modeling complex systems, as well as simpler systems, but where it really shines is in sophisticated cognitive systems. Single agent or multi-agent. And the following sections are going to present an overview of active inference, followed by application towards the domain of conflict, the active inference conflict model. All right, well, active inference, and of course, there's so much more that we could say here. I'm just doing this on my personal channel because it's an informal paper stream, but head over to the Active Inference Institute to learn more about active inference. Active inference is a behavioral modeling framework that integrates perception, cognition, and strategic action under a common currency. Reduction of free energy, and we're not going to go into detail about expected free energy here. However, in real-time unfolding settings with variational free energy and in prospective or anticipatory decision-making settings with expected free energy, we have integrated imperatives that allow us to do appropriate sense-making and decision-making. That's awesome. The Active Inference Conflict Model, AIC model, unifies some aspects of previous models of conflict and also generalizes conflict in order to capture business, operational, legal, technical, and social bolts aspects relevant to modern gray zone warfare. Another benefit of the AIC is that the model has sufficient flexibility to be used qualitatively or quantitatively across different timescales, from the tactical to the strategic, different structural scales, individuals, teams and organizations, communities, and states, and across domains and scenarios. Recently, it has been suggested that autoethnographic organizational approaches provide an amenable on-ramp to the active inference framework. We might call that analytic autoethnography. Now, multiple informal as well as technical introductions to ActInf and the broader free energy principle exist. This article is just going to describe a few of the most salient features that get us the quickest to the AIC model. So how can we think about this? AIC is going to provide a bridge between single-agent, real-time tactical decision-making models like OODA and broader strategic analyses, such as the generations of warfare model. Active inference is a development on Bayesian graphical modeling and as such accommodates multi-level cognitive processes. Due to its bottom-up modeling approach of nested systems of systems, AIC provides an avenue for integrating the analysis of military, non-military, and non-kinetic conflict, as well as cooperations and any other kind of interaction, real or imagined. Here, we visualize in Figure 5 some of the previous models described and situate AIC. On the y-axis, we have the continuum from tactical, operational, short-scale, single-agent models on through strategic and scholarship-level models, which tend to be broader, continental scale, multi-agent, bigger space, bigger in time. And on the x-axis, we have a continuum from qualitative on the left, with models that use natural language and narrative, and quantitative and formalized on the right, models that may not even be able to be expressed in natural language, but they use numbers or they use formalism. And we've just roughly placed the center of gravity for different methods, and we have positioned the AIC model as being able to cross the tactical strategy, scope and scale axis, as well as being able to cross the qualitative-quantitative gap. So, let's talk about some core active inference terms. These are terms from the active inference ontology, and we can think about these terms in terms of their usage at the tactical scale, the strategic scale, and the relationship between the tactical and the strategic scale. So, for example, an active inference entity tactically might be a human, or a computer system, or a drone. Strategically, an entity might correspond to a state, or a non-state actor, or an advanced persistent threat. And how are these two levels of analysis related? Larger entities are made up of smaller entities. Generative model. The generative model describes the short-term expectations for a given situation. Perception and action. This is the incoming causal dependencies on the Markov blanket, which we associate with perception and sensing, and the outgoing dependencies of the Markov blanket, which we associate with action and impact. Affordances and policy selection. Affordances are what actions can be taken. Policy selection or planning as inference is the decision-making process around which affordances to take. The expected free energy is an implicit or explicit prediction over a given time horizon about different policies that can be undertaken. And the action perception loop is the continuous flow of inbound sensory input and outgoing action input. That table reviews some of the core active inference terms that are then described in a bit more detail here on page 31. So we have active entity. A little bit of a distinction between mere and adaptive entity. Mere active inference entity being something more like an inert object, whereas an adaptive entity, or sometimes called a strange particle, is a more sophisticated cognitive system that usually includes a world model, understanding its own causal impact of self in world. Why is it useful to generalize across different kinds of entities? It enables many research, education, and application functionalities. Enough said for here. Generative model. Perception and action. Affordances and policy selection. Expected free energy, used for policy selection. And the action perception loop. So those are just a couple of the core terms from the active inference ontology, here being brought up to describe exactly how they're going to be used in the AIC model. And here we see a generative model for an active inference agent. Here, in the discrete time formalism, we use a partially observable Markov decision process. And please join the textbook group or study active inference if you want to know more about what this Bayes graph means. But in short, S is the hidden state. Let's think of that as the true underlying hidden temperature in the room. B describes how the hidden state changes through time. That's how temperature changes through time. D is our prior on the hidden state, our beliefs about temperature before we get an observation from the thermometer. O is the thermometer, giving us sensor readings. A is the emission matrix of hidden states, true temperatures of the room, emitting thermometer readings. Or you could run it back from what observations are to inference about hidden states. And the A matrix that maps between hidden states and observations, it could be a diagonal matrix, it could be a clean mapping, or it could be very noisy. This downstairs bit of the model describes the purely inferential components. Now we get into the policy selection and action part up top. Pi reflects policy. Policy are the action sequences that can be selected. E are the affordances. Those are the actions that can be taken in a given moment. G is the expected free energy. And weighing in on G is C, preferences, what we expect and prefer. That which is realized or moved towards realization is given pragmatic value. That which reduces uncertainty or updates our beliefs is associated with epistemic value. And pragmatic and epistemic value come together in G. Then we can use uncertainties and hyperpriors and all these other Bayesian modeling tools to really make this into as complex of a model as we want. Let's talk about a few cool features of active inference and how that matters for building the AIC model as a formal model of interacting conflict systems. So first, active inference is all about the agent interaction with a niche. That could be its surrounding biophysical niche, or it could be a social niche. Active inference explicitly enables us to model interacting entities. So let's look at a particular entity in its niche. So on the left side, we have an active inference agent. The internal states of the agent are reflective of cognition. They're getting influenced by incoming sensory states. Here's the thermometer readings coming in, and then there's going to be some learning and updating in the cognitive internal states, and then that results in some action being taken. Turn on the heater, or turn on the air conditioning, or whatever. This is the Markov blanket, consisting of action and sense states. Here, the external states, or what sometimes is called the generative process, is empty. And the reason why is because it could be an active inference model, but it doesn't have to be an active inference model. It could just be a sine wave, or it could be whatever you want it to be. So you don't need to know anything about the structure of external states in order to do accelerated optimization and variational free energy-based Bayesian inference on internal and action states, or autonomous states. Those, by the way, represent the two ways that an active inference agent can reduce free energy: change the mind through cognition, perception, and learning, or change the world through action. Now we're going to expand that a little bit into thinking about two active inference agents, A and B, on the left and on the right side, who are interacting through a shared niche. Now, that might be a biophysical ecology, stigmergy, niche modification. This might be a chat room that they're both in. This might be a blockchain that they're both able to read and write from. And so we can really flexibly and compose different settings that we want to do active inference modeling in. And sometimes, and most recently, this is called compositional cognitive cartography. Another feature of active inference is that it allows n-dimensional modeling of abstract space. If you want to model the hidden state space as just a binary yes or no, it's hot or it's cold, or there's 3 states, it's hot, medium, or cold, or 4 states or 500 states, you can basically develop arbitrary models in terms of the structure of the generative model and the generative process. So that allows a lot of flexibility, and you can, if you want to see this in action, refer to the modern literature on active inference and also check out the SPM, or statistical parametric mapping framework, in the way that it did sensor fusion of fMRI, EEG, and MEG neuroimaging mechanisms. So those are some of the features of the AIC model that allows us to capture the aspects that were described above in the review section, but now take this into the most modern way possible. So let's talk about using the AIC model. First, entity action loop and alignment with OODA. OODA is used every day in cockpits and in decision-making centers around the world. And so what does the active inference framework do that takes us further than what OODA does? Now, both OODA and ActInf are about the same territory, if they are. And so we're not going to disagree about how the system really behaves. What we're doing is thinking about describing differences between our maps. And so what is part of the ActInf map that's not part of the OODA map? Well, ActInf gives us this tremendously sophisticated quantitative and computational formalism, for example, describing regimes of attention and all of the associated other features that we have in the active inference literature. But let's try to orient or align active inference terms from the active inference ontology with the OODA way of thinking. So observe, we can map that to observations, sensory states. Orient, we can think about that in terms of prior beliefs about hidden states and the way that incoming observations update our beliefs about hidden states. Decide, this would be reflective of the expected free energy calculation. And act, action. And so we made a little visualization here in figure 9 with the same generative model describing the OODA loop. So here we have observation on the O, orientation, mapping the O through the A to the S, juxtaposing the D, and that gives us an updated S. We then go to the decide phase. We have inference on action during decision making, policy selection as inference, planning as inference. And when the policy is selected, we have action reflecting impact based upon state transitions in the world. And then we're into the next cycle. The AIC model does not replace prior models of conflict. It integrates them and offers a new medium for their expression. For example, AIC can be nested into and applied in agent-based models, game theory, as well as any other kind of model that one wants to. AIC isn't limited to integration with agent-based models. It can also plausibly be nested into EBO and network-centric warfare graphs. Additionally, given that ActInf is a Bayesian graph, AIC itself can be represented as a graph akin to those found in other graph-based models. How does AIC help us move beyond generations of warfare model? Well, first, we could use it to describe generations of warfare just as other authors have, although they didn't use active inference. But we can say that the active inference conflict AIC model has the capacity to model structurally flexible, nested, and interacting entities and embedded decision-making processes. This allows for standardized and formal representations of conflict, whether between ant colonies or nation states, or in the offhand chance between ant colonies and nation states. This analysis provided by AIC does not necessarily render previous narratives of conflict classification obsolete. Instead, we offer opportunities to support and extend, and offer more insight into the similarities between the various models. For example, we could return to classical Roman aphorisms describing estimation, uncertainty, and expectation, and connect that to other formal models or informal models. And so in that way, it's like a meta-analytic framework that helps us embrace, understand, and extend. As war evolves and adapts on numerous axes, the features described above come into play. Let's talk about modeling and discovering Bolt's conflict. This is some of the contributions that were led by Scott David. So, Bolt's is used to describe business, operation, legal, technical, and social components of systems. So let's think about Bolt's in the context of interacting active inference entities. So here we have entity A and B. Previously, they were interacting through the niche. But now let's think about A and B interacting through their niche as defined by Bolt's. And so that could be two business interactions interacting across a business interface, like sending money. Or this could be a supply chain interfacing on the operations. It could be a legal firm and another client interacting on legal. It could be two computational things interacting technically. It could be two people interacting socially. So everybody's still within their Markov blanket. Everybody is still engaging into the commons, but now we're going to represent the totality of that commons using the Bolt's mnemonic. And just for a little bit of fun, here we have entity C, who is outside of the direct conflict, like a bystander or a witness. And we can also connect to the abiotic niche, because we don't want to forget about those biophysical constraints. The next sections cover a little bit more detail about the Bolt's dynamics, business, operations, legal, technical, and social. We next turn to modeling cognitive security. Cognitive security, or CogSec, refers to the study, development, and implementation of practices, methodologies, and efforts made to defend against social engineering attempts, intentional and unintentional manipulations of, and disruptions to, cognition and sense-making. AIC's potential usage in the study of CogSec go far. Recent work on scripts and context-driven reflex and active inference rely on the same structure and methodology as AIC, and have a great potential in being applied to further our understanding of threat surfaces, given that so much of the threat surfaces that are relevant for CogSec and social engineering are related to the usage of social interfaces. Some further discussion on CogSec in different settings, and we introduce the concept of a CVE, Common Vulnerability and Exploits database, of narrative influence techniques and different ways of formalizing narrative information, work that continues to this day in the Atlas project and in other projects. Now, a further implication from use. Let's talk about future information structures and Rumsfeld's neglected quadrant. More details about thinking holistically about human interactions. Legacy institutions are struggling to understand and manage conflict in this rapidly evolving information landscape. This forces individuals to seek alternative structures and ways of risk reduction. Discussion of AIC as a costly ping, active inference. Discussions of the consequences from the move from a physical towards an informational emphasis. And this puts us into a space of non-rivalrous engagement. Physical property is rivalrous, but digital property may be or may not be rivalrous. we return to Rumsfeld quadrants. And now we can think about that as a lens over conflict among organizations or between organizations and abstracted phenomena. For example, the war on cancer, the war on drugs, the war on SARS-CoV-2, known as COVID-19. And we're going to talk about that lens of applying Rumsfeld quadrant to conflict, and that's going to highlight some thinking about Rumsfeld's neglected quadrant, the unknown knowns. Where is there room for an unknown known? The AIC model helps to formalize several situations in which unknown knowns exist. Known but inaccessible. Failures of curation. Back-turning. Selective disclosure. Known but undeciphered. And insufficient communication dynamics. We discuss unknown knowns within multi-agent systems. In this vein, the primary focus of knowledge management might be considered to be addressing the problem of unknown knowns. The AIC model, in its use as a lens, demonstrates the value of trust in sharing unknown knowns in a knowledge ecosystem in the form of several notable insights here. Trust is synonymous with reliability. Trust can be externalized to interfaces. Trust can be externalized to symbols and signals. Trust is a prerequisite for efficient information sharing. And trust is a prerequisite for collaborative enterprise. On to the discussion. In this paper, we briefly surveyed models of conflict, considered their strengths and inadequacies, proposed a unifying model based upon the application of active inference, and considered the usage of this active inference conflict, or AIC, model. Things continue to change. As Clausewitz said, war is the continuation of politics by other means. And we argue that that quote is incomplete, as it would appear that both war and politics are a continuation of conflict by other means. And in fact, conflict is just a continuation of the normal function of living systems in just another analytical framing. We have some further insights into the strengths and limitations of warfare models. We propose that people use active inference to study conflict and cooperation. We argued that the active inference model, as a consequence of being founded on matured quantitative models, as well as the rapidly evolving field of active inference, it's tractable to simulate, it can incorporate empirical data, and it can immediately be implemented qualitatively before the simulation to produce novel insights about various forms of conflict. For example, connecting the AIC model to OODA and GW demonstrated the relevance of integrating tactical and strategic frameworks within a single multiscale formal model. Of particular interest was the consideration of AIC to capture conflicts that have business, operational, legal, technical, and social components, thus moving beyond generations and gradients of war and offering new media for capturing metrics for classifying and clustering myriad forms of conflict. This allows us to model emerging conflict surfaces involving cognitive security and narrative warfare. And finally, we considered some broader implications. We reflected on the information environment today and on the non-rivalrous nature of information as asset. We therefore suggested that the AIC model is not just useful for the study of conflict, but also the design of systems that manage conflict. And finally, we applied the AIC model to reveal latent insights about trust and knowledge environments within the Rumsfeld quadrant. The AIC model provides an avenue for formal modeling of systems, but this same affordance also facilitates design and evaluation of the design of systems, and to implement and test bolts, norms, and rules. This is to say that a socio-technical system modeled with AIC can effectively be a twin of that socio-technical system, and thus be used for more than just studying conflicts, but also for managing and facilitating endogenous information conflict and friction itself. It took humans millennia to figure out how to convert the random motion of atoms energized by heat from fire into more useful work through the use of heat engines. The AIC framing invites consideration of how the equivalent of a combustion chamber might be configured for converting the frictions of disagreement into useful work within a knowledge environment in terms of developing new information, repairing faulty or incomplete information, discovering unknown knowns and unknown unknowns, and helping entities within develop trust and healthy information flows. In this context, de-risking of interactions in which information exchanges occur would not be seen as a state or some sort of state of exception, but rather an ongoing process which places pressure on designers of information systems to develop simple rules with effective protocols. We're very interested and have continued working on the AIC model in terms of leveraging existing approaches and returning to commons management in the setting of narrative information management, and think it can provide a new medium for formalizing, documenting, and sharing heuristics and practices for risk mitigation. The AIC model reveals that the search for unknown unknowns or known unknowns may need to be deprioritized, as this information may fail to be disseminated and integrated, rendering most relevant information as unknown knowns. Where hope was left in Pandora's box, it might be said that trust was left in Rumsfeld Matrix. The AIC model helps us demonstrate and codify the value of trust in knowledge ecosystems, which facilitates the sharing of unknown knowns. It also demonstrates how trust can be externalized to protocols and signals. Ultimately, a primary suggestion of this work is that facilitating mutual interdependencies, interfaces, and trust management frameworks could attract an increasing subset of information conflicts into generative structures, which can capture value and grow trust rather than accelerate discord. Below, we distill these and other insights within the work into recommendations for future research and design. First, it would be great to develop more work on using AIC to extend OODA loops in simulation decision-making software. This might use complex systems modeling frameworks like CAD/CAD, as well as models for active inference, whether in Julia or Python, MATLAB. Next, it would be great to explore the use of AIC in modeling past conflicts as a basis for measuring various attributes of those conflicts and get new insights from the past. We recommend to explore the use of AIC model and the integration of commons management principles and compensatory controls across the business operations, legal, technical, and social surfaces. Regarding the design of information system exchanges, we recommend the acknowledgement of de-risking as an ongoing process rather than as a static attribute or state of exception. Consider trust as synonymous with perceived reliability. Make use of the fact that trust can be externalized to signals and symbols so long as those signals and symbols are reliable indicators of behavior and state. And consider disagreement, inconsistency, and incoherence as events which can be mined for value via shared protocols and standards, rather than creating an illusion of security through attempts at their removal. So, by analogy to heat gradients or thermochemical gradients, we sometimes talk about information gradients. And when there's an information gradient, what's going to happen to it? Well, it could be a bomb, a dud, or an engine. A bomb's going to blow up in your face. A dud goes nothing, and it's a lost opportunity. But the engine is where we open the door to getting useful work out of this information combustion chamber. And we recommend that across many domains, war, scholarship, and design, we reprioritize Rumsfeld's neglected quadrant of unknown knowns. Maybe we already know more than we know. The project was facilitated by RJ, but all of us wrote and edited it. Here's our funding and acknowledgements, and here's the work cited, which I'll just briefly scroll through. All right. That brings us to the end of this stream. Hope that you have enjoyed it and that you found the paper useful. As mentioned earlier, it's now been about 2.5 years. No, 1.5 years since writing this, at least from this date, but longer that we've been thinking about these issues. And we're still active in this area. So, looking forward to your comments and questions and engagement. Best luck with everything. Sending you good cognitive security on your way. Be well. Till next time.